Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're unlocking the secrets of your body's hidden master conductor, the autonomic nervous system. While we go about our day, thinking, working, talking to friends, there's an entire secondary control network quietly operating behind the scenes, keeping us alive without us even realizing it.
All right, let's dive right into our mental map for today. We're going to cover 1. The nervous system divided, 2. Two autonomic forces, 3. Mapping out outflow tracks, 4. The enteric and adrenal systems, 5. Bladder control dynamics, and finally, 6. When the system fails.
So let's start with something we've all experienced. How does your body automatically know to dilate your pupils the second you step into a dark room? Or speed up your heart rate when someone jumps out and scares you without a single conscious thought from you? It's an absolutely crucial piece of our involuntary internal wiring.
Well, the magic word here is homeostasis, basically the physiological maintenance of a constant internal environment. Achieving this perfect balance, literally controlling everything from your blood pressure to your core body temperature and blood sugar, is the fundamental life-saving goal of the autonomic system. Okay, moving right along to section 1, the nervous system divided. You see, there's a pretty stark contrast between our two primary motor divisions. On one hand, you've got the somatic nervous system. This handles your conscious, voluntary control. It innervates roughly 750 skeletal muscles and relies on acetylcholine to actually make your limbs move. But on the flip side, the autonomic nervous system is entirely unconscious. It's completely involuntary. These visceromotor fibers bypass skeletal muscle altogether to supply your smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. It's the ultimate behind-the-scenes operator.
Which brings us to section 2, two autonomic forces. Now, this autonomic system isn't just one static network. It's actually split into two opposing yet incredibly complementary forces. First up, the sympathetic division. This one acts in sympathy with your emotions. It triggers that famous fight or flight response, mostly using noradrenaline to get the job done. In direct contrast to that, we have the parasympathetic division. This side drives your restorative rest and digest functions, using acetylcholine to actively maintain your body's baseline vegetative states. Basically, there is a constant systemic tug-of-war happening between these opposing divisions right now inside you. They target the exact same organs but trigger totally opposite physiological effects. For example, sympathetic stimulation aggressively ramps up your heartbeat and dilates your pupils during moments of intense stress. But once the threat is gone, the parasympathetic system actively steps right in to slow that heartbeat down and constrict those pupils back to normal. It's a constant, delicate balancing act.
All right, let's look at section 3, mapping out flow tracks. So where do these signals actually come from? Well, these central control pathways follow a really strict anatomical divide. The parasympathetic system has what we call a craniosacral outflow. That just means its nerves originate from specific cranial nerves right up in the brainstem, like the vagus nerve, and then all the way down at the very bottom in the sacral spinal cord. The sympathetic system, on the other hand, relies on a totally different thoracolumbar outflow, which is squeezed right into the middle regions of the spinal cord. Zooming in specifically on that sympathetic outflow, the cell bodies of these preganglionic sympathetic neurons are strictly locked to a specific region of the spinal cord's gray matter called the intermediolateral column. They're only present from the thoracic down to the upper lumbar segments, so T1 to L2 or L3. From there, these axons leave the spinal cord via the ventral motor route, join the spinal nerve, and then enter the sympathetic trunk. And here's where it gets really interesting. Once that preganglionic fiber enters the sympathetic chain, it has 4 rigid paths it can take. Path 1, it can synapse immediately on a postganglionic neuron at its own exact segmental level. Path 2, it can travel straight up the chain to synapse in a ganglion higher up, which is how it supplies places like your head. Path 3, it can travel down the chain to synapse in a lower ganglion. Or Path 4, it can bypass the chain entirely without synapsing at all, traveling out as splanchnic nerves to directly supply the gut.
Let's shift gears to section 4, the enteric and adrenal systems.
We have to talk about 2 massive exceptions here in the autonomic web. First, the enteric system. Amazingly, your gut actually operates largely independently from the rest of the central nervous system. It contains roughly 100 billion neurons, which, by the way, is the exact same number of neurons found in your entire spinal cord. It coordinates things like peristalsis on its own, though it does get modulated by those autonomic inputs we just talked about. The second big exception is the adrenal medulla. The inner core of the adrenal gland is essentially a modified sympathetic ganglion, but instead of sending out normal nerve fibers, its cells discharge adrenaline directly into the bloodstream. It acts like a massive, body-wide, hormone-driven fight-or-flight alarm.
Moving right along to Section 5, bladder control dynamics.
Now think about this for a second. How do two completely opposing nervous systems seamlessly coordinate to control a single, everyday organ like the bladder? It's a great question, and it perfectly frames the real-world, clinical application of that autonomic tug-of-war we've been breaking down.
The dual innervation of the bladder is honestly a beautifully synchronized handoff. Sympathetic nerves, remember those originate from the lower thoracic and upper lumbar regions, act to relax the bladder wall. We call this urinary accommodation, and it allows the bladder to safely store urine. But when it's finally time to release, the parasympathetic nerves, which come all the way down from that sacral outflow, kick in. They actively contract the bladder muscle to allow for emptying. It's just a brilliant, seamless handover between two totally different neurological tracks.
Finally, we reach Section 6, when the system fails. So, what happens clinically when this precise wiring gets damaged? A classic example is Horner's syndrome. Remember earlier when I mentioned how sympathetic fibers can travel up the chain to supply the head? Well, a targeted loss of this specific sympathetic nerve supply results directly in some highly visible symptoms on just one side of the face. A patient will show up with miosis, that's a small, unreacted pupil, because the dilator muscle literally lacks its nerve supply. They'll also have partial ptosis, which is a slight drooping of the eyelid. Plus, they'll experience facial anhidrosis, a complete loss of sweating on that side, and enophthalmos, which is a slight posterior displacement of the eye. It's a striking visual manifestation of internal, invisible nerve damage. Which leaves us with a pretty critical reflection to wrap up this explainer. If our unconscious internal systems are this delicately balanced, where a single interrupted pathway can literally change the shape of our eye or the rate of our heart, what else might be vulnerable to the slightest miswiring within us? It absolutely highlights the fragile brilliance of our hidden anatomy. I hope this deep dive sheds some light on your body's master conductor and helps you visualize these absolutely crucial neurological pathways. Keep exploring, and thanks for joining me today.